All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today to learn more about EEO Component 2 reporting. We are presenting this webinar in conjunction with Gallagher, and today we have Kenya Span presenting with us. My name is Nick Foucault. I'm a director with Points North. And as I mentioned, we have Kenya today, HR consulting manager and human resources and leadership consulting expert with Gallagher. We are very happy about our partnership with Gallagher here at Points North. Compliance in today's modern age is always changing. Very important to keep up with the latest developments. There's no better example of that than EEO Component 2 reporting. So very happy to have Kenya presenting with us today. And just a note before we do get started, attendee lines are muted. So attendees will not be able to speak, but are more than welcome and encouraged to submit any questions or comments via the chat function in the meeting. So please feel free to do that. We will get to those questions at the end of the session. So with all that being said, I will turn things over to you, Kenya.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be presenting to you today on this new EEO1 Component 2 reporting requirement that is coming up due at the end of the month of September. Again, I am Kenya Span. I'm an HR consulting manager within Gallagher's Human Resources and Leadership Consulting practice. A part of my role is definitely partnering with employers all across the country, whether they're mid-sized or large employers, on HR compliance initiatives, one being this new reporting requirement. So I am super excited to partner with Nick this afternoon to present on this topic. And of course, if there are questions that come up, looking forward to answering those to help you navigate through this new requirement. One other note I'd like to make on this topic is you are not alone. This is definitely new, so folks at the EEOC realize that this can be time-consuming, very labor-intensive, so they definitely have a lot of resources available, and of course you have Gallagher as well as Points North to assist you in these areas as well. So just to give you I want to say a bird's eye view about Gallagher. So Gallagher was a family-owned business, has been around since 1927, so definitely rich history within the organization. We have over 30,000 employees on a global scale across the country. Specifically within our HR practice, we have about 200 HR consultants that are across the country that are helping clients, again, navigate through these HR compliance initiatives. We do have about 230 plus benefit service offices worldwide. So just about every state, there is a Gallagher office and an HR resource that's available to support our clients. One of the things that we always, want to make sure for all of our clients to know is how much we do from a volunteerism perspective. We do believe in giving back. We do log our hours. Our CEO, Patrick Gallagher, is very committed to our organization with its volunteerism efforts. So oftentimes you may hear Gallagher, at various, whether it's it's a run, it's a walk, it's, a food bank, you name it. We do believe in giving back to the community and making sure we keep track of those service hours as well. We are focused on organic growth too. I just wanted to make that point as well. Today's webinar, again, we're going to navigate as much as we possibly can through the EEO's Component 2 reporting requirement, of course, as it applies to your organization. So first off, we are definitely going to talk about, well, what is this update all about? What does it mean to you as an employer? And then also we want to look at and say, okay, am I a covered employer? Who, is required to comply, who may be exempt from complying, because there's oftentimes confusion around which employers are actually required to comply with EEO 1 requirements. We're also going to touch on some action items for employers. And so that gives us an opportunity to share with you what are the things that you need to do as it relates to submitting your particular report. And lastly, end with some recommendations. So these would be from an HR best practice, business practice perspective. So both myself and Nick will be sharing information and resources for you as you go about preparing for this new requirement. All right, so let's get to the EEO 2 update. So before we jump in, I always like to remind folks that the EEO 1 report is a federally mandated survey. So this is a survey that collects an employer's workforce data, and it is typically categorized by race, ethnicity, sex, and job category. The EEOC has typically used this information to enforce, federal law against any employer that may be engaging in or potentially engaging in employment discrimination or discriminatory pay type practices. Although the EEOC, when it comes to an employer being required to comply with this report, will send notification letters out, it's still an employer's responsibility for obtaining and submitting the necessary information prior to any appropriate deadline. So if an employer actually fails or refuses to file an EEO 1 report as required, they may be, in a situation where non-compliance and may be subject to certain fines and different types of penalties. And if they're a federal contractor, they may be at risk of losing certain government contracts. So it's important for you guys to know what are the requirements, who's required to comply. And if you fall within that category and not receive a notification, that's going to be your responsibility to reach out to the EEOC to ensure, in fact, that you are required and what are the necessary steps that you need to take. So let's just dive in and say there are a few key things that you need to know about the EEO 1 Component 2 filing. So while the EEOC has created a wonderful list of frequently asked questions and other materials to assist employers with the submission of the Component 2 data, this process can still be confusing. And so there are, of course, very important points to remember. One, employers need to know that they must file 2017 and 2018 Component 2 compensation data by September 30th, which is just around the corner. You're going to hear a lot of information over communicated during this webinar, but we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding as it relates to your requirements and what information actually does need to be reported. So again, for this particular requirement that's due at September 30th, it is compensation data for 2017 and for 2018. There will be a workforce snapshot period, which again, the employer can choose between October 1st and December 31st of that particular reporting year to say, okay, this is the information that you have decided to report on for that 2017 year and as well as for the 2018 year. The one thing that the EEOC decided to do throughout this whole process is contract with the NORC at the University of Chicago to conduct the Component 2 EEO 1 compensation data collection, again, for the 2017 and 2018 year. So what are the new reporting requirements? So when we look at what's really changed here or what are employers required to do, so the employers are actually required to identify the compensation band in which to count an employee's compensation. So you would need to look for box 1, that is the wages, tips, and other compensation of the IRS Form W-2 as your measure of pay. So employers should not just use gross earnings for an employer or particular employee instead of using box 1. So this was a very, very clear requirement that employers are to use the actual wage information from a given employee's W-2 form, box 1. So again, we want to make sure you know that. Component 2 instructions were actually adopted from the Fair Labor Standards Act, better known, of course, as FLSA, definition of the hours worked. So therefore, hours worked data that employers report for the EEO1 component 2 will be based on the same hours worked that employers record for FLSA purposes. So again, we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding as it relates to what is new as it relates to this component 2 reporting. So you will see wage information from box 1 of the W-2 form, in addition to total hours worked for employees. And that information has been further broken down by an employee's race, gender, ethnicity, and job category. When it comes to the multi-establishment employers, they are required to submit the reports for each location. So even though you had a reporting requirement earlier in the year and you may have been a multi-establishment employer, you are still required to provide that same information if you meet the requirement criteria for reporting on component 2. You will still submit a report for each one of those locations. The difference is that you are pulling information from box 1 on the W-2 form and the total hours worked. So oftentimes when it comes to a covered employer and trying to determine whether or not an employer is excluded from the filing requirements, most employers take the position that they're not required, maybe because they have some level of an exemption. So employers that are excluded include private employers with fewer than 100 employees. You can have federal contractors with fewer than 50 employees, and that's federal contractors and subcontractors. State and local government employers, elementary and high schools, higher ed institutions, American Indian and Alaska Native tribes, and lastly, tax-exempt private membership clubs other than labor organizations. So bottom line, the EEO1 reporting requirement is a requirement by law for those entities that are required to do so. One point of note that I want to make here, because oftentimes when people hear that tax-exempt organizations are excluded from the filing requirements, again, it's tax-exempt organizations that are private membership clubs. That means religious organizations, although they are tax-exempt, they are required to submit the EEO component 2 data to the EEOC, again, if they meet that threshold of 100 or more employees. So how is the EEO1 report similar to component 2? So at the end of the day, it's pretty much the same information. So you're still pulling the data on employees, on your active employees from the period October 1st through December 31st. So you're still pulling a payroll period for that time, which is the same as you would have done for component one's filing. The difference here is you are now required to provide compensation data and total hours worked. In addition, this year has not only required for the information from the prior year, but you're actually required now to report for both 2017 and the 2018 year. So that's a really big difference for a lot of employers that were just used to having to look back at the prior year, select the appropriate payroll period of their own choosing between October 1st and December 31st. But now you're having to do both 2017 and 2018. So when you're selecting a payroll period in December, employers, it's always important that you only want to use the data if that information was reported in box 1 on their W-2 for that same year, not the following year. So again, you want to make sure when you're looking at that payroll data that you want to use as your reporting period, your workforce snapshot reporting period, it was the employee's pay reported on box 1 from their W-2 in that given year. So how is the EEO-1 report different from component 2? So it's very simple. It's going to take a bit more time to complete. For a lot of employers, they may have their EEO-1 component 1 data pretty set when it comes to race, ethnicity, gender, and job categories. But now you've got this additional component where you're having to pull that compensation data and those hours worked. So it does take a bit more time as you look at the categories that are reflected on the EEO-1 form and categorizing all of the population by race, by gender, by ethnicity, and job category to be able to submit that information directly onto the EEOC's web portal. So when you compare it to what you may have done for the first reporting period that was extended from March 31st to May 31st, expect to be spending a bit more time as you go about in the manual intervention that you will actually have to engage in into ensuring that you are accurately reporting employee information, again, compensation and hours worked based off of the pay bands that the EEOC has prepared and entered on the form. We'll see the form as a snapshot of that on a couple slides later on in the presentation. And here it is. So as you can see, this is just a sample of what you can expect. So you've got the different job categories. They remain unchanged. While the new form, it looks pretty much the same, but when you look at the different, the 12 salary bands starting from 19,000 to 39 and under, all the way to category 12 of 208,000 and over, when you think about how you will actually have to categorize your population, race and ethnicity, and then looking at the job categories, that is a very, very big deal. And now you can probably get a sense of how time consuming this is when you compare it to what you may have had to complete for use when it comes to the compensation data for box 1 of the W-2 for the entire year, because they wanted a way to measure pay, because of course it includes wages and tips and overtime and potential supplemental pay and other measures of compensation that provide a more comprehensive measure of an employee's pay that could potentially be affected. So again, as you see just this small snapshot of what the reporting form looks like, just think about how you have to further categorize employees based off of hours worked and now their compensation within the respective categories that have always been a part of the EEO-1 reporting requirement. So let's move on to multi-establishment companies. So if a multi-establishment employer has, establishments with fewer than 50 or more than 50, there are different types of forms. So again, you can be an employer that has different, unique federal identification numbers for each one of your locations. You are still required to file a report for each one of your locations. If you have 3 locations, you are required. If you have 30 locations, you are required. As long as you, at the end of the day, if you're over 100 employees, if you're a federal contractor, for component 2, over 100 employees, you will be required to file for the EEO-1 component 2. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of reports. So you're an employer, you have multiple sites. You will start with what is called a headquarters report. So that is typically a report that is type 3. And this is a report that you would consider your main office, your district office, your headquarters report. So you would provide all of the employee data as it's requested and required on the EEO-1 form. That is considered your parent company. So everybody working at that location or receiving work out of that location, that is the report that you would use. Now, what would happen when you have employees at your other locations, if you have less than 50 employees, you have to select a report that complies with less than 50, and then that's type 2, and then you would, type 2 is a consolidated, then you would actually have to provide the report if you have more than employees. So you can actually have 3 employees operating at one location. You still need to file a report. If you have 51 employees at another location, you still need to do a report. Then lastly, the consolidated report is a compilation of all of your employees. So that includes every single location you have that is reported on that consolidated report type 2. So that information that you've listed for your headquarters, your locations for over 50, your locations for under 50, all of that information is going to be reflected on that last report, which is that consolidated report. So how is the EEO-1 report different from component 2? So the good news here is, while federal contractors are typically required, if they have 50 or more, to file an EEO-1 report for component 1. For this year, while the EEOC has not indicated for next year yet, and a federal contractor that has less than 100 employees, they are not required to file for component 2. So again, if you're a federal contractor and you have 52 employees, you should have already completed component 1. But if you still have 52 employees and you are, wondering whether or not you need to complete the EEO-1's component 2, you do not have to file a report. So that's probably one break that some federal contractors are able to take advantage of. So for employers wondering, well, how do you submit your EEO1 component 2 report? So the EEOC has provided 3 types of options. So one, you have employers that can manually enter the data directly on the web portal that they have set up. They have also alternative reporting mechanisms in place where an employer can use information to upload a file directly onto the website, or an employer may also mail data on a CD to the EEOC. I would say that the last one is rarely used. Most employers, unfortunately, mainly manually enter the data directly onto the portal. One other note to make here is the data file has to be formatted according to the EEOC specifications, which is why a lot of times employers have a tendency to manually enter the data, because while they may say, okay, this is the format of the file that needs to be uploaded, oftentimes employers receive some form of an error, and it's so time consuming to try to get through that, they end up manually having to key in all of that data, which again increases a lot of the time for an employer to actually have to engage in all of this while they've already tried to pull all of the data together. Now to have to manually enter it directly onto the portal can in fact be time consuming. So you can have your file if you use their format, whether it's, what kind of spreadsheet that you're using. If it doesn't meet the requirements, that data file will in fact be rejected. So what do I need to know about uploading the electronic file? So let's talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure most of you are saying, okay, I don't want to have to manually enter all of this data directly onto the file. So the EEOC has certain data file specifications. So it can be a CSV file or an XML. So when you have a data file that typically will, be rejected, oftentimes it may not necessarily just be because you've selected the wrong file specification. It could be that certain data is missing from field. So again, by the time you go through your headquarters report, your reports to reflect where you have over 50 or under 50 in your consolidated report, if you're missing certain fields and if numbers are not adding up, the system is sophisticated enough to know that, hey, some information is missing. So it's not enough to just enter data in for the sake of entering in to say you're in compliance. You need to make sure that your information is actually totaling up. So your consolidated report should actually capture every one of your employees that are all reflected on your headquarters and your other reports that you would have reported on for more than 50 or less than 50. So it is critical that you do understand that, again, it may not just be the file specification, it might be some data that's actually missing off of the file. Another point of note is when you are putting this information directly on the site, where it's manual or whether you're uploading it, you always want to make sure at that very last requirement, when that information has been accepted, that you receive a certification. That certification is your final step for as an employer to ensure your data was uploaded successfully. The EEOC will immediately on the website, as you're uploading that information, will indicate if it has been successful. They will send you the certification form. You're able to download that for record keeping purposes to show that you did in fact comply within the time frame that has been set, which is September 30th. At that certification step, again, The person, of course, that's responsible for reporting, so whether it's your human resources team or someone else that has been designated with this particular task, you need to make sure, again, data is accurate, correct format. So once that file is accepted and certified, that you are downloading the necessary documents to prove, in fact, that you did comply with the EEO 1's component 2 requirements. So let's talk a little bit again about covered employers. So I know we've mentioned this and we definitely shared here that we want to over communicate this because it's critical. It's very, very important. Again, if you're a private employer with over 100 employees, you are required to provide that workforce snapshot period for 2017, 2018. Federal contractors, again, if you have been a federal contractor and you're more than 50 but less than 100, you were in that space, you already should have completed component 1, but if you're less than 100, you are not required to file for component 2. So again, just make sure that you have good documentation to support that. If you were ever questioned about why you didn't complete it, although I've not seen the EEOC really go to certain federal contractors to say this, but understand this is a new reporting requirement. At this point, we really don't know a lot with, how the EEOC is truly going to plan to use this information. We do know that they are going to have more to see if there's some pay discrimination practices and different things like that, but we're not at this point have been given any type of information to show if the EEOC will actually make some outreach attempts to employers directly, especially if they had to comply with component 1, but for some reason were not required to comply with component 2. Another question that does tend to come up a lot is the EEO reporting requirement is whether or not employers should include part-time workers. If you have employees that are active and they're on your payroll, they are a part of your employee census that you would have pulled during that period of October through December. So part-time, they may have been active, full-time, active in that time frame, that payroll snapshot that you selected, doesn't matter, you need to pull that data. And lastly, of course, if your employee count does not meet the 100 threshold. So what happens when you have a situation where maybe you were at 100 employees, but for some reason for component 2, you have less than 100 employees for that period. You're not required to file. So you can, in fact, during that October 1st and December 31st period for component 2, if you had less than 100 employees during that time frame, you are not required to file an EEO component 2. So that's another kind of time saver if, in fact, you happen to be an employer that did drop below the 100 threshold for October 1st through December 31st for 2017 and 2018. So what does this mean for your organization? So again, you've got a lot of data that you're working with, and all this data is very, very important. If you're a multi-establishment employer, again, you have to make sure that you're reporting for every single one of your locations. Even though collectively you are 100 employee population, but just because you may have 2 or 3 at one location and 80 at another, you are capturing the data for each of those locations separately. You want to make sure that you do have some kind of way to show the compensation for employees that's on box 1 of the W-2s that does show what their earnings, their wages were, and ensure that as you are categorizing and putting folks into those various pay bands and their hours worked, and that is further sorted by their gender, the race, and job category, all of that information again is being uploaded to the EEOC's web portal. And then finally, you want to determine, whether or not your organization, how are you capturing this data today? Are you partnering with your payroll folks, your HR, finance, IT, just to make sure from a reporting perspective that to ensure that you're not putting yourself in a situation where you may potentially incur penalties because you have reporting challenges today. You want to make sure that you are going through the steps right now to ensure that you have sufficient and accurate information for upload by September 30th of this year. So when we think about and talk about calculating hours worked, this is something that comes up as a typical pain point when we think about our non-exempt and exempt population. So our non-exempt population, so those are the folks that are your hourly workers. These are folks that are paid by the hour. So whether or not you have time clocks or some kind of electronic timesheet, paper timesheets, you are utilizing the hours based off of your time and attendance records for your non-exempt hourly workers when you're calculating the hours worked. For your exempt employees, now most employers don't really capture hours worked for their exempt. So these are your salaried workers that have fixed wages. In these cases, the EEOC has allowed for employers to use a standard 40 hours for full-time workers and a standard 20 hours for the part-time workers as a proxy for hours worked per week. So if you have 40 hours as your standard work week, or 35 hours as your standard work week, or 37 and a half, you can use that standard hour as for your full time. And these again are folks that received a fixed wage, not eligible for overtime. You can just use the standard 40 hours or the standard 20 hours for your part-time workers. And again, there are employers, we do realize, that do possibly track exempt workers differently. You are allowed to use your own unique standards. So again, if you have 37 and a half or 35, depending on what's your standard work week, you are more than welcome to use that, but understanding that the EEOC has in fact allowed for employers just to put in a standard 40, a standard 20 for the exempt population. So when you think about everything that has been discussed thus far, when you're preparing to file, again, it's important that you kind of have a starting point of what workforce snapshot period are you going to use for component 2 for the 2017 and for the 2018 year. Points of note, it might be beneficial to use a snapshot that's between October 1st and December 31st that maybe have the least amount of employees, still over 100, but if for some reason you may have had 150 at the beginning of October and at the end of December you had 300, you might want to use the one that is more beneficial for you, that's less time intensive, labor intensive. You want to make sure that you're generating reports and you're validating that data on, an employee's demographic information. So again, their race, their gender, the job category, the box 1 from the W-2 data report, and the hours worked, again, for that 2017-2018 year. And then make some decisions on how, in fact, you want to file your reporting requirement, whether you manually key this information in, or you have the right file specs in order to have a file uploaded directly into the site, again, by the September 30th deadline. So at Gallagher, we have a model, as you can see here on the slide. It says organizational well-being, and this is our Gallagher Better Works model. This is a very strategic approach when we always say, how can we be better? So if we were to break this down as far as the reporting requirements, as an employer, you can kind of rank yourself to determine maybe you're good because maybe you understand the new EEOC component 2 requirements. And you said, okay, you know what, I get a good sense of what's actually required of me as an employer. But maybe you have some employers that are in a better state and say, you know what, you're confident that your reporting information is accurate. So you've got all the W-2 data from box 1, you've got your hours worked, you've got employee information that's categorized by race, gender, and job category. You've got that information, and you're in a pretty good position to be ready to submit your data by the September 30th due date. Or either you've got the best case scenario where you've got your information, you're ready to file, you can submit, and you are confident that everything that you submitted will be acceptable by the Department of Labor or a potential EEOC audit. And so you've got the documentation to back it up, all of the time information, salary information, employee demographic information based off of the workforce snapshot period that you did select. So as we talk about all of these different steps and all of these different requirements of an employer, so it's really important that as an employer, you're engaging with experts that can help you navigate through this. For most employers, they really may not have the internal resources to pull all of this data. It's very time consuming to enter the data and file it by the due date. Maybe there are other initiatives that are going on. So it is really important to know that with Gallagher and Points North, we've got experts. We're the experts, and we're helping employers just like you go through some of these really big challenges. Another area that you also need to be engaging is your payroll providers, making sure that your payroll providers are accurately recording your information correctly, that they have, whether you have a time and attendance component that's combined with your payroll, you need to inquire with them to make sure that they're capturing the data, it's being stored accurately. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be your payroll provider's responsibility or liability. This information is going to fall back on the employer if, in fact, you do not validate the accuracy of the data that you submit to the EEOC. The EEOC will come to you as the employer, not to your payroll provider. And again, you know, being experts at Gallagher and at Points North, we can help you to further understand each one of your individual situations for the 2017 and 2018 reporting period. We can help you navigate what that really is going to look like, and even help you to understand after you submit it, because it can give you some ideas about, wow, you didn't know that your workforce was made up in such a way, or the compensation was reporting, you know, the way it was reporting, or even the hours worked. So again, we are here to assist you to better understand the data that you are submitting, and also what you need to do as far as next steps to ensure that your information will be accepted by the EEOC.
Thank you, Kenya. This is Nick with Points North, and I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about our company and what we do in conjunction with Gallagher. So we are a software firm based out of Minnesota in the compliance solutions space. And simply put, we help organizations meet their compliance needs. Our newest area is EEO reporting. We do this by having a team behind our products. So the software products that we offer are robust, are secure, are current and modern, but the team behind those systems are well versed in the actual subject matter that the systems are designed to support. That's a real differentiator for us in terms of how we help clients with these complex subject matter. Our data is and our websites are all stored and operated within secure data center environments, all of which are SOC 1, SOC 2, HIPAA, and ISO certified. Our company also has a formal information security program, and all employees do complete annual HIPAA and security awareness training. Our typical pricing model involves a one-time implementation cost, which gets a client from A to Z in terms of getting fully up and running, trained, and live on our platforms. And then we have an annual license fee model, which supports continual access to the systems, all the data within them, our customer service team, our in-house subject matter experts, and ongoing updates and new functionality. Specific to EEOC Component 2 reporting, which, as we've heard, is coming up due September 30th, the end of this month, your organization should really be asking some key questions at this point. The first and foremost being, do you have the data? We've heard about the data elements that are required, as well as the new data elements being introduced for the first time with Component 2, namely the salary and the hours data. So is that data readily available? Do you have a system in place to complete this reporting? If you have to do it manually, we've seen that that's extremely burdensome and extremely prone to errors. So is there a system in place ready to leverage your existing data to complete this reporting? Is there a team behind this? At Points North, as we've said, we have the subject matter experts in-house with us to support our programs and our processes. Do you have a team in place that can help with that? And is there a process surrounding all of this to ensure that the September 30th deadline is met? In terms of recommendations for next steps, it is absolutely time to start taking action. So everything you've seen and heard today should be prompting action as to the next steps for your organization to meet this September 30th reporting deadline. Review the data that you do have today, see if there are any gaps. You know, for example, do you have ethnicity codes set up for only a certain subset of your employee population? So take a look at the data that you do have today, make sure that it's ready and that it's quality, and put a process in place to meet this reporting deadline. Also, consulting with experts. Gallagher, as well as Points North, are absolutely ready to help in this area, and it is a recommendation that you engage outside experts on this compliance issue because, as we've seen and heard, it is extremely complicated.
All right, some key takeaways. So there's a lot of information here. So what do you do now? So now is the time, and it's probably past the time a little bit, but you really want to start to look at, what your internal processes look like and determine, from a pay practice perspective, do you potentially have any, pay disparities that can't be explained by legitimate business reasons, such as job tenure or job education? Some of those internal audits do help with respect to what you're going to have to, what's going to be reported out. And so if you already know that there are some gaps, that gives you information to say, okay, what are some things that we might need to do, very, very differently. So again, when you're submitting that 2017, 2018 pay data to the EEOC and the information that's coming from box one of the W-2 information and how it's reporting that compensation of total hours worked by gender, race, and ethnicity of employees and their job categories, it's going to give you an inside view to, okay, we have some challenges here as it relates to our compensation or how, the demographic, what is the demographic information telling you, about your workforce population? So again, we love to over communicate. We want to make sure that private employers with over 100 employees, federal contractors with over 100 employees or more, that you are required to submit this new compliance requirement for the component 2 due by September 30th. And again, we can't say it enough. There's a ton of resources out here. The EEOC definitely has a help desk, and they have some FAQs directly on their website to help employers navigate through this new compliance requirement. You can actually reach them by email or by phone. If you want to email them, they are eeoccompdata@norc.org, or you can contact them by phone at 877-324-6214. And of course, if you want to, of course, talk with us at Gallagher or Points North, our contact information is provided at the end of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Kenya. And for our last few moments here, we will go ahead and open this up to Q&A. And just as a reminder, if you are an attendee, your line is muted, but please do submit questions via the chat function. We do have a few of them that have come in. And before we get to those, there are some standard questions that are asked quite a bit. We'll just cover those briefly. So Kenya, perhaps you could speak to this question.
Sure. So how will I know if my files are accepted? So right here directly on the screen. So you will see a message on the computer monitor prompting them to certify and submit your report. That's your clear indication that the information that, whether you manually key the information in or if you met the filing requirements to upload the file, you will have a pop-up that will basically indicate you have completed the data for all of your establishments. They will ask you, of course, to review that consolidated report, especially for your multi-establishment employers, for accuracy. Once all of that information has been submitted, you will click on the certified report, and you want to click proceed with the certification. And that is your indication that your information has in fact been accepted.
Thank you, Kenny. And just as a comment for you, it became a little bit more difficult to hear you just a little while ago. So I'm not sure if anything changed on your end, but it became a little bit muffled.
Oh, sorry about that. Not sure about that. So I will repeat my response. So when you are going to accept your file, you want to look for a pop-up at the very end from the EEOC, basically indicating you have completed the data for all requirements as shown on this slide. There is a button that will say certify your reports. That is your indication whether the information you manually keyed in or the file that you uploaded has in fact been successful. But in order to certify your reports with the EEOC to complete the compliance requirement, you must click on certified reports.
Great, thank you. That was much clearer. And then our second question here, how will I know if my files were approved?
All right, so very clearly, if in fact your file has not been approved, you are going to get a rejected button. So this could be a number of things. So it could be if you manually keyed information in, there could be a situation where there was some data missing. So that's why it's critical when you go back and look at that information you're keying in, especially for multi-employer establishments, you want to make sure that that consolidated report truly represents every single one of your employees within each category on your other filing reports. If it does not, you are not going to be able to submit. If you do have problems, this is why it's critical to start this process now. The EEOC is not going to accept, unless it is something on their end with their system, that you were unable or unsuccessful with submitting your report. because you received a rejection, you do need to notify the EEOC if, in fact, that there is possibly something from a technical perspective wrong with their system. But at the end of the day, you will not be in compliance if you receive a rejected notice. That means you may need to go back, look at the file specifications you've uploaded, or review your data again to ensure that you've captured all of the information accurately.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kenya. And I saw a question come in. It says, if we're picking December 31st as the snapshot period, are we recording year-to-date W-2 Box 1 wages or just for that period? Same with hours. Is it the current snapshot period or year-to-date hours?
So you want to make sure that the hours and the Box 1 W-2 data, they need to match up. So if you're picking December 31st for your 2017 and 2018 year, you want to make sure that you're not picking, different hours than what the compensation is reflected. They need to be all the same.
Great, and a couple of questions here that I can take directly, Kenya. One of them being, will this webinar be available as a recording? Absolutely, we will follow up after this session, and we will provide this webinar as a recorded link for everybody who attended. Also a question, are all software vendors for EEOC created equal? What are some of the differentiators? And I can tell you there are three things that really differentiate a software vendor in this space. One of them is having in-house experts. So as we've seen and heard, this is complex subject matter. Having in-house experts behind a software product is really a key thing, especially when it comes to the new Component 2 data. Also, of course, having a robust product and solution, one of quality, is very key, and then a dedicated team behind it to work with you during the process. So rather than just set things up and kind of walk away, having a dedicated customer success team behind the product to work directly with you is a big differentiator in this space. And finally, since we're very close to the end of the session here, one more question. I'll turn this one over to you, Kenya. Just a little bit of background on when and how did the Component 2 filing actually become a requirement?
So this was actually talked about back in 2017. A lot of employers were in a big uproar around, oh my goodness, they have to now start pulling the hours working compensation data. But actually, after a federal court decision on April 25th of this year, the decision was rendered that the private employers with 100 or more and federal contractors will have until September 30th to submit the paid data to the EEOC, setting a new deadline for the previously stated Obama-era reporting regulations. So this did, in fact, come out in 2017. There was a stay, and of course it came back around, and now it is official, now a requirement, where, again, employers do have only a few short weeks to get all of this information if they meet the eligibility criteria to submit the data.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Kenya. Wonderful job, and very much appreciate you presenting with us today. We're very proud at Points North of our professional partnership with Gallagher, and we're happy to be able to provide valuable webinars like the one today. So again, Kenya, thank you very much for doing this with us.
Thank you.
We've worked really closely with Gallagher to create an EEO compliant software platform that can address employer needs in advance of the September 30th deadline and leverage the existing data that you already have available through your other platforms. So for those of you considering the need for an expert team and a robust solution, we can certainly work well with all payroll providers and do that in a very streamlined and integrated way. So you can see Kenya's information here. Please feel free to contact her if you have questions. My contact information is here as well. And again, we will follow up to provide this webinar as a recording. And so again, just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and please do enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thank you again, Kenya.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.